All women are different, but they are all women. This video is androcentric from a men's point of view and is presented as opinion, commentary, and debate. Expressing opinions is not violence. These are ideas to challenge, question, and argue in public, because classical liberalism relies on the First Amendment for its dialectic. If you are a feminist, then consider this. If patriarchy truly existed as claimed, feminism could not. And if all men are trash and women are equal to men, then what are we to conclude? Women will die for their children. Men will die for their wives and children. And God chose to die for all mankind. Authority rolls up with responsibility. If this framing of facts offends you, click off to a cute cat video. Proceeding further will expose you to gamma bias and criticism directed at ideas, claims, institutions, not at any individual's virtue or dignity. Our method follows the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and the transcendentals, the good, true, and beautiful. If this framework is not for you, feel free to exit now. It's no disgrace. Women are wonderful. God bless America. Men are great. Feminismus delendus est. Grievance Capital, a red-pilled analysis of victimhood economics, written by Conrad Riker. Available now, links in description. Grievance Capital, a field guide for men who still notice reality. Fasting is fascism. How the left's war on breakfast, markets, and reality refutes itself. My grandmother fasted before communion every Sunday of her life. She also survived the bombing of Hamburg, where actual fascism reduced her neighborhood to cinders and her neighbors to charred outlines on basement walls. I mention this because a publication with a 6-figure readership has just declared that her communion, fast, voluntary abstention from food, a spiritual discipline, was not devotion but a gateway drug to fascism, a temporal colonization of her flesh by the patriarchy. Let that absurdity breathe for a moment. A woman who dug her sister out of rubble with her bare hands, who raised 4 children in the corpse of a collapsed civilization, who chose to empty her stomach before receiving the body of Christ. This woman, according to the professional grievance merchants of the 21st century, was sewing the chains of her own subjugation every time she declined breakfast. The insult is so grotesque it achieves a kind of dark comedy, like watching a chimp throw feces at a stained glass window and call it art criticism. But I will not laugh, because this document, this wellness trap article, is not merely wrong. It is a perfect specimen. It is the entire epistemological collapse of leftist thought pinned and preserved under glass, and I am going to dissect it for you organ by diseased organ. You will watch me demonstrate how fascism has been drained of meaning until it describes a woman choosing not to eat for 16 hours. You will see subjective feeling elevated above measurable fact, voluntary recast as authoritarian, and discipline, the very virtue that built every civilization worth the name, reclassified as obedience training for a political movement that ended in 1945. I will prove, using the classical tools of reason that our ancestors refined over millennia, that this ideology cannot survive its own premises. Its universal claims deny universality. Its demands for agency strip women of agency. Its cries of victimhood manufacture the helplessness they pretend to oppose. And its authors know none of this, because the entire apparatus of modern thought is designed to prevent the encounter with self-contradiction. Here is what the article cannot explain, and what I will. Why the wellness industry it attacks was built almost entirely by women for women in female-dominated spaces. Why the stock market it calls phallic is indifferent to genital morphology, responsive only to price and risk, like a calculator that does not care about your feelings. Why male confidence is not baseless arrogance, but the psychological armor of a sex that absorbs 93% of workplace fatalities, 76% of suicides, and virtually 100% of battlefield deaths. The article surveys this landscape of male disposability and concludes that women are the victims, because somewhere a man dared to feel certain about something. By the time I finish, you will understand why its final demand to burn the casino down is the eternal confession of the parasite. If you cannot build, destroy. If you cannot fast, criminalize fasting. If you cannot endure the discipline that elevates man above beast, declare that discipline a hate crime against those who lack the will for it. And you will understand something far more important, that the capacity to defer gratification, to align desire with an objective order that does not care about your opinion of it. This is not fascism. It is the single thread separating civilization from the screaming infant who believes the sun vanishes when he closes his eyes.
Bunkum article by a feminist, PhD. The Wellness Trap: How Biohacking is the New Patriarchy. Hear me, the collective is bleeding, and the wound is shaped like a clock, a stock ticker, and a wet wipe. We are living under the suffocating weight of somatic fascism, the patriarchal mandate to discipline, shrink, and optimize the female body for the male gaze and the capitalist grind. You think you are just getting healthy? You are sewing the chains of your own subjugation. Let's talk about the wellness to alt-right pipeline. It starts with a seemingly innocent desire to detox. You download an app. You start intermittent fasting. Suddenly, you are worshipping at the altar of the 16:8 window. Do you not see the violence? This is not health. This is temporal colonization. By forcing your body to adhere to a rigid, linear schedule, a schedule historically designed by male scientists to maximize labor output, you are internalizing the discipline of the factory floor. Fasting is the dietary gateway drug to fascism. It teaches you to say no to your own desires, to prioritize an abstract rule over your lived visceral reality. It primes you for obedience to the alt-right, which demands the same rigid hierarchical obedience to natural order. Starving yourself on a schedule isn't biohacking, it's gender treason. And how does this regime of optimization sustain itself? Through the weaponization of universal claims. The medical industry, run by white men in lab coats, tells you there is a universal standard of health. This is a lie designed to erase difference. There is no universal metabolism. There is only the biological reality of the marginalized versus the biological reality of the oppressor. When you accept that calories in, calories out is a universal of the makeup remover wipe. Women spend hours painting on a face acceptable to the patriarchy, only to scrub it off in exhaustion at midnight. This is unpaid emotional labor. The wipe itself is a metaphor for our oppression, a disposable, rough square soaked in chemicals, used to erase the performance that was demanded of us. The patriarchy demands we be visible and perfect for their consumption, but invisible and silent in our maintenance. The wipe is the erasure of our agency. You are literally washing your selfhood down the drain. But the violence doesn't stop at the bathroom sink. It invades the economy. Consider investing. Why is the stock market so aggressive? Because it is a phallic arena of accumulation, rewarding hypermasculine risk-taking and predatory behavior. This brings us to why confidence is gendered. When a man walks into a boardroom and declares he is a genius, he is confident. When a woman does it, she is hysterical or difficult. The confidence gap is not a psychological failing of women. It is a structural mechanism of economic control. Men are rewarded for their baseless arrogance. They invest in failing companies. They lie on resumes. They project certainty into the void, and the system rewards them for it. This is gamma bias in action. Male failure is framed as risk-taking, while female caution is framed as lack of confidence. We don't need to teach women to be more confident in a rigged game. We need to burn the casino down. Confidence is just another word for the privilege of being believed. We must reject the fascist logic of the body and the market. Stop fasting, stop washing off your war paint to please them, and stop trying to accumulate wealth in a system built on your exploitation. Dismantle the clock, decolonize the flesh. The epistemic wasteland: how somatic fascism reveals the left's war on reality itself. I once watched a 3-year-old in a grocery store throw herself on the floor, screaming that the existence of the vegetable aisle was an act of violence against her person. Her mother, instead of correcting her, crouched down and validated her lived experience of produce-based trauma. That child is now employed as a cultural critic, and she has written the article you just read. Her central thesis, that a voluntary eating schedule is fascism, that objective metabolism is colonialism, and that washing your face is unpaid labor, would be adorable if it weren't the operating software of every HR department, university administration, and democratic policy platform in the Western world. Let us dissect this cadaver with the tools our civilization built for exactly this purpose: grammar, logic, and the ruthless scalpel of rhetoric. The term fascism originates from the Latin fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe, carried by Roman lictors to symbolize lawful authority and collective strength. It referred to a specific political system: centralized dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strict economic and social regimentation. A woman deciding not to eat between 8 p.m. and noon the following day is not fascism. It is a dietary preference. This writer has committed what logicians call a category error of such staggering proportions that it disqualifies her from every serious conversation that has ever occurred since Thales first speculated about the fundamental substance of the cosmos. When you expand fascism to include having a schedule, you have not deepened our comprehension of tyranny. You have merely drained the term of all meaning, ensuring that when genuine tyranny arrives, nobody will recognize it because they will be too busy calling their alarm clock a dictator. Let us trace this semantic inflation to its source, because it is not accidental. It is the respiratory system of grievance economics. One writer calls fasting violence. She calls self-improvement subjugation. She calls discipline sewing the chains of your own oppression. Each inflation serves a precise function. It monopolizes the moral capital of genuine victimhood. When discomfort with a clock equals violence, then the word violence can no longer distinguish between a bruised ego and a bruised body, between a hurt feeling and a fractured skull. This is not carelessness with language. This is a deliberate strategy. The wider the definition of harm, the larger the market for grievance. The more behaviors that qualify as violent, the more experts are needed to police them. The more administrators are needed to adjudicate them. The more consultants are needed to train compliance with whatever new orthodoxy declares itself the cure. You are not being protected, you are being farmed. Now consider the writer's central claim that fasting is a dietary gateway drug to fascism because it teaches you to say no to your own desires and primes you for obedience to the alt-right. Let us formalize this as a syllogism to see if it survives contact with logic. Major premise: obedience to any abstract rule primes, one for political authoritarianism. Minor premise: fasting involves obedience to a temporal rule. Conclusion: fasting primes one for fascism. The hidden premise that all discipline is authoritarianism destroys the argument the moment you make it explicit. By this logic, brushing your teeth twice daily is a gateway to totalitarianism. Arriving at work on time is a rehearsal for dictatorship. Refraining from punching someone who annoys you is a dry run for the Gestapo. The writer has not made a political argument. She has made the argument of a toddler who has discovered that rules exist and finds the discovery intolerable. Every civilization that has ever endured, from Stoic Rome to monastic Christendom to the Islamic Golden Age, has practiced fasting as a discipline of the soul. They were not rehearsing for dictatorship. They were building the self-mastery necessary to resist it. This writer's epistemology, her theory of knowledge, is where the rot reaches the foundation. She asserts that objective truth is a tool of hegemony and that subjective feelings like bloating, fatigue, and lethargy constitute valid epistemic states that prove the standard is violent. Translation: your discomfort falsifies physical reality. This is the epistemology of the child who believes the sun vanishes when he closes his eyes. By this standard, the diabetic who feels fine before slipping into a coma possesses an epistemic state superior to his glucometer. The cancer patient who feels healthy possesses knowledge superior to her biopsy. She is not advancing situated knowledge. She is advancing solipsism in academic costume, and she is demanding that the entire edifice of medical science, built by centuries of men who subjected their hypotheses to the merciless court of empirical verification, bow before her stomachache. And here we face the shell game that makes this entire ideology immune to reason. The writer denies universal metabolic realities, calories in, calories out, while simultaneously advancing her own universalist claims about patriarchal mandates and colonial logic. Watch the trick closely. There are no universal truths, she announces in a sentence she intends to be universally true. Objective truth is a tool of hegemony, she declares, in a statement she wants you to accept as objectively true. This is the self-devouring serpent of postmodern epistemology, and it renders every subsequent claim unfalsifiable, and therefore meaningless by the standards of any civilization that values reason. She has not disproved objective truth. She has demonstrated that she cannot open her mouth without relying on it. Now consider the makeup wipe, this essayist's chosen symbol of patriarchal oppression. Women spend hours painting on a face acceptable to the patriarchy, only to scrub it off in exhaustion, performing unpaid emotional labor. This would be a devastating indictment if it were true. But cosmetic industry data consistently demonstrates that women purchase and apply cosmetics primarily to compete with and signal status to other women, not to attract men. Cross-cultural studies confirm that women use more cosmetics in female-dominant social contexts than in male-dominant ones. The writer has transformed a voluntary aesthetic practice, driven largely by intrasexual competition, into evidence of male tyranny. By her standard, a man choosing a necktie is performing unpaid emotional labor for the matriarchy. A woman selecting shoes is a victim of the shoe industrial complex. The category expands until it encompasses all human choice, at which point it explains nothing and indicts everything. Yet the most revealing moment arrives when the writer describes a woman who fasts as committing gender treason. Treason, a word that implies allegiance owed to a collective, a debt incurred by mere existence, a crime punishable by social death. A woman's body in this framing does not belong to her. It belongs to the political project. She may not choose what to eat, when to eat, or how to manage her health without permission from the ideology that claims ownership of her flesh. The writer does not oppose bodily control. She opposes who controls the body. The woman who fasts of her own free will is a traitor. The woman who parrots the article's dogma is liberated. The cage has simply changed hands, and the new warden is far less forgiving than the old one, because the old warden at least allowed you to choose your own breakfast. The writer calls adherence to a daily schedule temporal colonization, the imposition of rigid linear time upon the female body. She has discovered that clocks exist, and she is furious about it. Every farmer who rose with the sun, every monk who prayed the canonical hours, every mother who scheduled her infants' feedings, all were, apparently, unconscious agents of temporal fascism. The natural circadian rhythm itself, the 24-hour cycle hardwired into mammalian biology, is now a patriarchal imposition. She has confused discovering order in nature with imposing order upon nature, a distinction any competent natural philosopher resolved in a single sentence before finishing his morning coffee. Time is not a patriarchal construct. It is the medium in which consequence unfolds. And her fury at it is really fury, at the existence of consequence itself, at the fact that choices have results, that bodies respond to inputs, that reality does not care about her feelings. Consider the broader architecture of this ideology. The writer asserts that the stock market is a phallic arena of accumulation rewarding hypermasculine risk-taking. When a man projects confidence, he is praised. When a woman does it, she is called hysterical or difficult. This is her evidence for gamma bias, the supposed structural mechanism that rewards male failure as risk-taking, while punishing female caution as lack of confidence. But the data tells a different story. Women control over 80% of consumer spending decisions in the United States. Women now outnumber men in higher education enrollment. Family courts award custody to mothers in over 80% of contested cases. Women receive 63% shorter sentences than men for identical crimes. The confidence gap she laments is not evidence of structural oppression. It is evidence that women have been told by articles exactly like this one that any failure they experience is someone else's fault, that any discomfort they feel is evidence of systemic violence, and that the appropriate response to obstacle is not self-improvement but accusation. The writer tells you to burn the casino down rather than learn to play the game. This is the mathematics of resentment, the algebra of those who cannot compete and therefore declare competition itself illegitimate. It is not a political program. It is a temper tantrum elevated to a worldview, and it has been elevated by institutional machinery, universities, media outlets, HR departments, therapy practices that profit from your belief that you are a victim. Every grievance minted into currency enriches the mint. Every harm inflated into violence expands the market for harm management. Every standard declared oppressive creates a consultancy contract for someone to diagnose the oppression. You are not being liberated, you are being processed. The Western tradition offers a different path. Aristotle defined courage as the mean between cowardice and recklessness, the disciplined choice to face what must be faced. The Stoics practiced voluntary discomfort precisely to strengthen the will against fortune. The monastics fasted to discipline the flesh and elevate the spirit. These traditions did not view the body as an enemy to be punished, nor as a tyrant to be obeyed, but as material to be shaped toward excellence. They understood what the writer does not, that freedom is not the absence of discipline, but the mastery of it, that the man who cannot say no to his appetites is not free, but enslaved to them. The writer calls discipline fascism, because discipline threatens the only power she recognizes, the power to complain, to accuse, to demand that reality reshape itself around her preferences. Reality will not reshape itself. Your metabolism will not consult your feelings before processing glucose. The stock market will not pause to validate your epistemic state before rewarding risk and punishing stagnation. And the civilization that produced antibiotics, indoor plumbing, representative government, and the very device on which you are reading these words, was not built by people who regarded discipline as oppression and schedules as violence. It was built by men and women who understood that freedom requires the very self-mastery the writer denounces. The path back to sanity is simple, though not easy. Define your terms precisely, follow the logic where it leads, submit your conclusions to the tribunal of evidence, and refuse, categorically refuse, to accept the proposition that your discomfort constitutes proof of someone else's guilt. The child in the grocery store was wrong about the vegetable aisle. The writer is wrong about everything else. The difference is that the child had an excuse. Strip the ideology down. Take every abstraction, the structural oppression, the phallic markets, the confidence gap as control mechanism, and place it inside a room with 4 walls, 2 human beings, and a transaction. The sophistry evaporates when forced to breathe the air of observable reality. Reality does not defer to your standpoint. Reality does not care about your lived experience. Reality has a balance sheet. Watch what happens when the entire architecture of grievance encounters the most basic marketplace exchange and must account for itself without the protective fog of academic jargon. The casino of resentment, why burning it down, always burns the builders. A man walks into a bank. He has no income, no assets, no credit history, and no plan. He asks for $1 million. The loan officer, a woman, denies him. He leaves. The next day, a woman walks into the same bank. She has a 6-figure salary, a decade of investment returns, and a business plan with projected revenues. She asks for $1 million. The loan officer, a man, approves her. According to the article we are dissecting, the man was exercising baseless arrogance, and the woman was suffering structural oppression because she had to prepare. The article calls this gamma bias. I call it a neurological event. the moment a human mind encounters reality and decides to sue it. Let us examine the article's central claim about male confidence, that it is baseless, that men lie on resumes, that they project certainty into the void. Notice what is missing from these assertions: a single datum, a solitary footnote, a whisper of evidence. The article presents these claims as self-evident, which is precisely how a cult presents its doctrines. You do not argue that the great pumpkin exists. You know it in your fibers. Male confidence is pathological because the article says so. Female lack of confidence is structural oppression because the article says so. The asymmetry is not an accident, it is load-bearing. If male confidence were acknowledged as earned through years of failure, rejection, grinding, and the conscious suppression of the impulse to complain, the entire grievance architecture collapses like a shed in a hurricane. So male confidence must be rendered baseless by fiat. It must be stolen, hollowed out, and displayed as a trophy. This is not analysis, it is intellectual looting. Now consider what the article refuses to see. When a man takes a risk, when he invests his savings in a business, when he quits a stable job to build something from nothing, when he walks onto a construction site, or into a mine or onto an oil rig, he is not rewarded with gentle encouragement. He is rewarded with a 93% share of workplace fatalities. He is rewarded with a 76% share of suicides. He is rewarded with a 77% share of homicide victims. He is rewarded with a 96% share of battlefield deaths. These are not opinions. These are numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the CDC, and the FBI, institutions not exactly famous for their red-pilled sympathies. The article looks at this mountain of male corpses and sees nothing. A blind spot, a rounding error. Male suffering is not real suffering. Male risk is not real risk. Male death is not real death. It is background noise in the gynocentric frequency, like the hum of a refrigerator you stop hearing after a week. And what of this confidence gap the article insists is a structural mechanism of control? The meta-studies confirm it exists cross-culturally. This is not controversial among psychologists who still practice actual science. But the article does not want women to become confident. That would require work. That would require confronting failure and enduring it without blaming a phantom patriarchy. That would require the one thing the article exists to prevent: agency. No, the article wants confidence redefined as a symptom of oppression, so that its absence becomes a badge of moral superiority. I am not unconfident, I am oppressed. What a delicious sleight of hand, what a gilded exit from personal responsibility. The drunk does not say, I have a drinking problem. He says the world drove me to it. The article is the bartender who nods sympathetically and pours another round. Now we arrive at the article's prescription. Burn the casino down. I want you to pause and let that sentence breathe. Let it fill the room like smoke. The casino, the market economy, the system of capital allocation, investment and wealth creation was built overwhelmingly by men. Men designed the financial instruments. Men constructed the buildings. Men laid the cable. Men wrote the algorithms. Men maintain the infrastructure. Men die maintaining the infrastructure. The article's solution to perceived unfairness is not to build a better casino. It is not to compete. It is not to learn the rules and master them. It is to burn it down. This is the arsonist's ethic. If you cannot create, destroy. If you cannot compete, level. And who rebuilds after the burning? Always the same demographic. The men whose confidence the article just finished pathologizing. The men whose baseless arrogance somehow produces every functioning structure in the observable world. The text dubs the stock market phallic for rewarding aggressive accumulation. By this reasoning, a savings account is phallic. A vegetable garden is phallic. A squirrel burying nuts in October is performing patriarchal hegemony. The writers have realized that resource gathering takes a shape vaguely tied to male anatomy and framed it as an argument. This fails as analysis. It represents pareidolia, the human habit of noticing meaningful patterns within random stimuli, much like spotting the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast. the stock market remains entirely agnostic. It lacks concern regarding your gender, your feelings, your lived experience, or your epistemic state. It functions as a price discovery mechanism. It links capital to productive use. Assigning genital morphology to an abstract clearinghouse reveals nothing regarding the market and exposes the writer's obsessive sexual categorization of all reality. Not everything is a penis. Some things are simply systems. The article says the game is rigged. I agree. But it is rigged in precisely the opposite direction. Family courts award primary custody to mothers in over 80% of cases. Women receive 63% shorter criminal sentences than men for equivalent crimes, controlling for all variables. A study published in a peer-reviewed journal, not a men's rights blog. Women control over 80% of household spending decisions. Women earn the majority of college degrees. Women have access to gender-exclusive scholarships, grants, hiring quotas, mentorship programs, and government set-asides that have no male equivalent. The article surveys this landscape of asymmetric female advantage and concludes that women are the victims because a man somewhere is still confident. The selective perception required to sustain this conclusion would qualify as a clinical disorder if it were not so politically useful. And what of this unpaid labor? The article invokes the ritualistic humiliation of the makeup wipe, the endless performance for the male gaze. Let us discuss actual unpaid labor. Men work more total hours per week, paid plus unpaid, than women in every developed nation studied by the OECD. Men perform 96% of battlefield deaths. Men constitute over 76% of the homeless. Male net lifetime tax contribution is positive in every Western nation with available data. Female net lifetime tax contribution is negative. Men are the only demographic that pays more into the system than it extracts. And the article calls this system built on women's exploitation. The arithmetic disagrees. The article does not dispute the data. It simply never encounters it, because the institutional knowledge production apparatus is calibrated to amplify female grievance and attenuate male contribution to silence. Nowhere does the article suggest that a woman might fast because she wants mental clarity. Nowhere does it suggest she might invest because she wants financial independence. Nowhere does it suggest she might wear or remove makeup because she chooses to, for her own reasons, on her own terms, by her own agency. The article cannot grant women agency because agency would destroy the grievance. Women must remain objects acted upon by patriarchal forces, forever passive, forever victimized, forever in need of the article's ideological priesthood to interpret reality on their behalf. This is not feminism. It is infantilization in a pantsuit. It is the most insidious form of control ever devised, the kind the prisoner enforces upon herself, then calls liberation. The essay's fundamental reasoning functions like a perpetual motion device of bitterness. Experiencing hardship grants moral superiority, which in turn bestows the power to demand total submission. Yielding never brings satisfaction, because being satisfied would terminate the grievance and thereby destroy that dominance. Consequently, fresh offences must be manufactured without end. The wellness industry, the clock, the stock market, the makeup wipe, each represents a fresh battleground in an expansionary conflict that can never conclude, because the fighters' very identities rely on the hostilities persisting. This does not equal liberation. It represents a pure addiction to outrage, to victimhood, to the sweet narcotic of never holding oneself accountable for one's own situation. The casino does not care whether you win or lose. However, the arsonist needs you to believe the game is rigged, because if you ever realized you could learn to play, you would no longer require the arsonist. You have read this far because something in you recognized the spell, even if you could not yet name it. You felt the cognitive dissonance every time a HR facilitator told you your silence was violence. Every time a former partner rewrote your shared history into a prosecution narrative. Every time you watched a man lose his children in a family courtroom. where due process was a nostalgic memory and the standard of proof was whichever woman cried first. You are not crazy, you are not broken. You are waking up, and the grogginess you feel is the narcotic of gynocentric propaganda leaving your system. The article we have dissected together is not an outlier. It is the logical terminus of an ideology that has been constructing its own reality for 60 years, brick by semantic brick, until men like you could be persuaded that your strength was tyranny, your restraint was weakness, and your silence was consent. Consider what we have established. We have demonstrated that somatic fascism is a category error, so cavernous you could park a fleet of lorries in it. That fasting is a discipline older than writing and practiced by civilizations that never heard of the stock market. That the confidence gap exists because men absorb 93% of workplace fatalities and 76% of suicides and still show up to build the infrastructure that carries this pathetic drivel to your screen. We have shown that the wellness industry was built by women for women, and that the article's authors must erase this fact to preserve their central fiction of female passivity. We have traced the logic of grievance to its terminus, a machine that must manufacture new grievances because old ones would mean the war is over, and the war is the only identity its combatants possess. Every claim collapses under elementary scrutiny, every sentence reverses itself. The ideology is a snake swallowing its own tail and calling the digestion liberation. Here is what they do not want you to know. Men are the only net lifetime taxpayers in every Western nation with available data. You pay more into the system than you will ever extract. Your labor funds the universities that call you oppressors, the HR departments that profile you as risks, the family courts that strip you of your children, and the media platforms that censor your objections. The cuckoldry rate in paternity testing studies hovers between 10 and 30%, depending on the country, and the law in most jurisdictions still holds you financially liable for a child you did not sire if you signed the birth certificate in good faith. The abortion rate in the West exceeds 600,000 per year in the United States alone, and the ideological apparatus that cheers this figure as reproductive freedom is the same one that calls your choice to skip breakfast gender treason. They do not want you to have agency over your body, your time, or your labor. They want you to have obligations without rights, duties without standing, and guilt without trial. That is not equity. That is servitude dressed in the vocabulary of justice. I am not asking you to hate. Hate is their currency, and I will not fund their economy. I am asking you to see. See the pattern: discipline reframed as violence, achievement reframed as privilege, male suffering rendered invisible by editorial fiat, female agency erased to preserve the victim narrative that powers the entire machine. See the architecture: the semantic inflation that turns discomfort into harm, the standpoint epistemology that replaces measurement with testimony, the self-sealing logic that converts your objection into proof of your guilt. See the endgame: a civilization that cannot distinguish between a dietary protocol and totalitarianism, cannot distinguish between freedom and tyranny, between truth and propaganda, between the builder and the arsonist. When every standard is oppression and every outcome is evidence of conspiracy, the only remaining virtue is obedience to the priesthood that defines the terms. You are the builder. You always have been. You laid the roads, wired the grids, wrote the constitutions, fought the wars, funded the institutions, and maintained the infrastructure that allows pampered academics to type the word fascism on devices, manufactured by male labor, powered by male-engineered electrical grids, distributed through male-constructed logistics networks, into a civilization built by men who believed in something larger than their own grievances. You do not need to burn anything down. You need to stop apologizing for building it in the first place. You need to look at the soaring cathedral of Western civilization, the tradition that gave the world the syllogism, the mixed constitution, the natural law, the apprenticeship mastery ladder, the concept of due process, the hospital, the university, and the scientific method, And you need to say, with the calm authority of the man who laid every stone, "This is good, this is true, this is beautiful, and I will not be ashamed of it." Go forth, share what you have learned, plant the seed in another man's mind, and watch the spell break, as spells always break, when someone finally has the courage to state the obvious. The emperor has no clothes, the ideology has no logic. And the man who sees clearly is the most dangerous creature the grievance machine can encounter, because he cannot be shamed into silence by arguments that collapse the moment anyone checks the definitions. And now the sponsored book introduction.
Grievance Capital, a red-pilled analysis of victimhood economics. I spent 7 years inside the belly of the beast, a Fortune 500 technology corporation that, on paper, produced software, but in practice, manufactured grievance. I watched men with 15 years of systems architecture experience passed over for promotion because they lacked the correct constellation of pronouns in their email signatures. I witnessed a vice president of engineering, a man who had personally built the data pipeline generating $40 million of annual recurring revenue, marched into a human resources inquisition for the crime of stating, during a retrospective meeting, that the codebase required refactoring before new features could be added. The female project manager, whose feelings he had allegedly bruised, could not distinguish a stack from a heap, could not explain Big O notation if her life depended on it, and had been hired 6 months prior from a junior marketing position at a defunct cosmetic startup. She filed a complaint. He received a formal warning. The codebase was not refactored. 6 months later, it collapsed under its own technical debt during a peak traffic event, costing the company $11 million and the jobs of 37 people, none of whom were the project manager or the human resources officer who had facilitated this inversion of competence. That was my baptism in Grievance Capital. I did not understand it at the time. I thought it was an anomaly, a localized outbreak of bureaucratic insanity that rational men would eventually correct through the simple application of observable reality. I was wrong. It was not an anomaly. It was the system. The system was working exactly as designed, and the design was extraction. The extraction was not of mineral resources or agricultural surplus. The extraction was of masculine competence, converted through the alchemy of institutional grievance into social and financial capital for the ideologically compliant. The currency of this extraction was not gold or silver. The currency was suffering, manufactured, exaggerated, and weaponized suffering, denominated in the emotional fragility of the incompetent and redeemed through the institutional machinery of human resources, diversity initiatives, and the endless, suffocating consensus of the collective. This book is the result of my systematic, obsessive, 10-year analysis of that system. It is the result of my refusal to accept the explanations offered by the system's priesthood, and my determination to rip the mask from its face using the only tools that cannot be corrupted by emotional manipulation. Classical grammar, formal logic, and rhetoric forged in the fire of objective truth. You hold in your hands a weapon, not a self-help book, not a collection of inspirational fables designed to make you feel validated while leaving you impotent. A weapon. A weapon forged from the same intellectual tradition that built Western civilization from the mud of the Mediterranean to the surface of the moon, the trivium. Grammar, the art of defining terms with such accuracy that manipulation becomes impossible. Logic, the art of constructing arguments with such formal rigor that emotional sabotage collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Rhetoric, the art of delivering truth with such force that the lies anchoring this degenerate order shatter like glass struck by iron. The trivium is not a technique. It is the operating system of rational cognition, and it has been deliberately stripped from your education, your institutions, and your vocabulary, because a man who can define his terms, construct his syllogisms, and deliver his conclusions with accuracy is a man who cannot be gaslit, manipulated, or enslaved by the soft totalitarianism of emotional consensus. The architecture of this book follows the natural progression of the trivium itself. We begin with grammar, the grammar of grievance, defining the parasite, because the first and most devastating mistake men make in this war is accepting the enemy's definitions. Grievance is not a complaint. Grievance is capital. It is a commodity minted in the mint of manufactured victimhood, exchanged in the marketplace of institutional sympathy, and redeemed for real resources, promotions, protections, immunities from accountability, and the power to destroy competent men without consequence. Once you understand the grammar, you will see the mechanism everywhere. The feminization of the enterprise will demonstrate how female solipsism, the psychological reality that women experience the self as the default center of all relational and emotional reality, has been elevated from a personal cognitive bias to the governing principle of corporate policy. HR, as the high priesthood of the soft totalitarianism, will expose the human resources department not as a support function, but as a pseudo-religious institution enforcing ideological orthodoxy through the sacraments of mandatory empathy, compelled confession, and the constant ambient threat of professional excommunication for the crime of wrongthink. The logic part of this book will dismantle the ideological foundations of this order, using syllogisms so formally airtight that no honest interlocutor can escape their conclusions. The satanic inversion of merit, equity as a war on reality, will prove, through categorical and hypothetical syllogisms rooted in empirical observation, that equity is not justice. Equity is the precise negation of justice. Justice is the assignment of reward according to merit. Equity is the assignment of reward according to demographic identity. These are not merely different policies. They are logical contradictories. They cannot coexist. Every equity initiative is therefore by definition a direct assault on justice, and every institution that implements equity has declared war on reality itself, because reality is the ultimate tribunal of merit. Ontological fragility. Weaponizing the glass ego will dissect the psychological mechanism by which fragile identity constructs, identities built not on achievement, but on narrative membership, are weaponized against objective critique. To question a grievance claim is not interpreted as intellectual disagreement, it is interpreted as existential annihilation. This is not hyperbole. This is the literal phenomenological experience of the ontologically fragile. Criticism equals death, and therefore criticism must be prohibited as violence. The stonic contract state, law, and the institutional husband will trace the economic and legal architecture by which the state has replaced the husband as the primary provider for female resource extraction, converting marriage from a productive partnership into a liquidation event, and converting the corporate workplace from a productive enterprise into a redistribution engine. Hypergamy in the boardroom, the biological imperative of corporate destruction, will demonstrate that the destruction of corporate competence is not accidental, it is biological. Female hypergamy, the evolved mating strategy that drives women to seek the highest status male available, does not deactivate when women enter the boardroom, it redirects. Unable to find a single alpha male to dominate the corporate hierarchy, the hypergamic instinct fragments into a decentralized war against all masculine competence. Because the presence of competent men in positions of authority triggers the same psychological mechanisms that would be triggered by a mate who is insufficiently dominant. The result is not cooperation. The result is sabotage, the empathic ontological inversion. Why Vibe replaces logic will document the epistemological catastrophe that occurs when feeling is elevated above fact as the criterion for truth, and the velvety strangled genocide. Soft totalitarianism in action will demonstrate, through historical and contemporary case studies, why it is infinitely more difficult to resist a tyranny that hugs you than a tyranny that shoots you. A man can recognize a boot on his neck. A man cannot easily recognize a pillow over his face, especially when the pillow is embroidered with the word inclusion. The rhetoric part of this book will arm you with the tools to fight back. The architecture of the meritocracy, rebuilding the bastion of logos, will provide the framework for constructing organizational environments that are structurally immune to ideological subversion, not through counter-ideology, but through the ruthless, impersonal authority of measurable production. The dialectic of the alpha, mastering the red pill argumentation, will teach you the specific argumentative forms, tactical distinctions, and rhetorical devices required to obliterate professional gaslighting in real time, in front of witnesses with such devastating precision that your opponents will think twice before attempting emotional manipulation in your presence again. The epistemology of the masculine, objective truth versus narrative truth will establish on philosophical foundations extending from Aristotle through Aquinas to the present, that objective truth exists, that it is accessible to human reason, and that the entire ideological edifice of wokeness, feminism, and cultural Marxism collapses the moment one refuses to accept the premise that narrative carries equal epistemic weight with empirical observation. The economics of the logos, production over extraction, will reframe the entire conflict in economic terms. Masculinity produces. Femininity, untethered from masculine discipline, extracts. The metaphysics of the gladiator, frame control in a dying empire, will teach you the psychological architecture of unbreakable frame control. The ability to maintain your composure, your logic, and your authority in the face of chaotic, irrational, and deliberately provocative emotional attacks, and the restoration of the vertical. Rebuilding civilization from the ashes will close with the teleological vision necessary to sustain the fight. A civilization ordered not by the horizontal, egalitarian, leveling impulse of resentment, but by the vertical, hierarchical, aspirational impulse of excellence. This book is not for everyone. If you believe that diversity is a strength independent of the competence of the individuals involved, put this book down. Walk away. You are already a casualty of the system described in these pages, and reading further will only cause you distress without providing the intellectual framework necessary to escape your conditioning. If you believe that emotional discomfort constitutes objective harm, that offense is a form of violence, or that the purpose of a corporation is to provide a therapeutic environment for its employees rather than a productive output for its customers and shareholders, close this cover immediately and find something that confirms your existing beliefs. There are thousands of such books. They will not challenge you. They will not require you to think. They will simply repeat the catechism of the soft totalitarianism back to you in slightly different words until you feel sufficiently validated to continue participating in the extraction system without questioning its premises. Go read those. This is not for you. This book is for the man who has watched his competence punished while his mediocrity was rewarded with promotion. This book is for the man who has sat through a diversity training session and felt in the marrow of his bones that he was participating not in education, but in ideological subjugation, but could not articulate exactly why, because the vocabulary of his objection had been systematically stripped from institutional discourse. This book is for the man who has been accused of creating a hostile work environment for the crime of stating a fact, and who absorbed the accusation in silence because the cost of dissent exceeded the cost of submission. This book is for the man who senses that the entire institutional order has turned against him, not because of anything he has done, but because of what he represents: competence, logic, emotional resilience, and the terrifying, liberating, unyielding authority of objective truth. The insights contained in these pages will change your relationship with every institution you encounter. You will no longer be confused by the irrationality of corporate policy, because you will understand the grammar of its construction. You will no longer be defenseless against emotional manipulation, because you will possess the logical tools to dismantle it in real time. You will no longer be paralyzed by the fear of ideological accusation, because you will have the rhetorical skill to turn the accusation back upon the accuser with such force that the entire dynamic of the conversation permanently inverts. You will walk into your workplace, your social environment, your family structure, and your own mind armed with the intellectual tradition that built the greatest civilization in human history, and you will use that tradition to defend yourself, your livelihood, and your sanity against an ideological assault that has been operating unchecked for decades. There is a war being waged against competence, against logic, against masculinity, and against truth itself. It is being waged not with bullets and bombs, but with definitions and syllogisms and the relentless, suffocating pressure of institutional consensus. You cannot fight a war of ideas without ideas. You cannot defeat an enemy who controls the definitions of the words you are permitted to use. You cannot resist an ideology that has already captured the grammar of your resistance. The first step in winning this war is learning the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement are the trivium. The trivium is the sword that cuts through the velvet curtain of soft totalitarianism and reveals the machinery of extraction operating behind it. Take up the sword, learn its weight, learn its edge, and then use it with the precision, the ruthlessness, and the unapologetic authority of a man who has decided that he will no longer be extracted from, manipulated, or silenced by the agents of a dying, feminized, anti-civilizational order. Grievance Capital. A red-pilled analysis of victimhood economics, written by Conrad Riker. Buy now. Links in description.